Hello and welcome to Philosophy Bakes Bread, food for thought about life and leadership. This is Eric Thomas Weber. When I started this podcast, it was my hope that I might make time to put out episodes on a regular basis, such as every month or two. It has become quite clear to me that it'll be tough to do that when things get especially busy. The reason is happy, though. In September of 2015, the University Press of Mississippi released my latest book, Uniting Mississippi, Democracy and Leadership in the South. My intention was for the book both to contribute to scholarship and to speak, especially to people beyond the academy. The good news is that it has been sparking some discussion, both at academic talks and in the newspaper and TV news. The cool thing about news attention is that it helps to demonstrate that philosophy bakes bread. Newspapers and TV news stations get paid because people value the information that they offer. Advertisers want in on that attention, on that value, so they pay for it. They quite literally put a cash value on ideas. John Dewey noticed that early on in his career and went on to become America's great public philosopher, but that's another story. Since I've been focused a lot on Uniting Mississippi recently, and since I mean for it to demonstrate also that philosophy bakes bread, I decided to record my latest talk. I gave the following presentation at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture on Wednesday, February 3rd in 2016. Here's the talk, recorded with a lapel mic hooked up to my cell phone, if you can believe it. The recording begins after the very nice intro that I received, and stops before the Q&A. I hope that this recording scratches the itch for those people who want to hear some philosophy bake bread. Here goes. Probably this line has been repeated more than any events for Southern Studies, so it's familiar. But Faulkner says, to understand the world, you got to understand a place like Mississippi. For my purposes as a philosopher studying leadership, it seemed to me that it made all the sense in the world to look close to home when looking for challenges for my theories of leadership. And so I adapt Faulkner's line to say, to understand leadership, you got to understand it for a place like Mississippi. There's a line from Warren Buffett. He says, in America, the only thing Americans don't like to buy on sale are stocks. We want to buy them when things are valued high, when things have been going up. But of course, where you want to buy them is when they're low and going to go up. I bring that up because I believe in the metaphor, and I believe it's true, that Mississippi stock has been significantly undervalued. Or at least, perhaps another way of saying it, is that I believe Mississippi stock could very seriously and substantially improve and increase in the future. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the problems that I see in Mississippi, but I'm also going to offer what I think are some useful ways of thinking as well as of acting for bringing about change. In particular, as far as the problems go, there's one of the reasons we've had such entrenched problems in Mississippi is that we appear to have a catch-22. It is well known and been said by Governor Winter, by Haley Barbour, and by Governor Bryant and others that the road out of poverty runs by the schoolhouse door. The problem is that it's hard to succeed in education when you're poor. It's also very hard to succeed in education when our schools aren't well funded. And so those two things together make it very difficult to stimulate an economy if you need education to stimulate the economy. It's hard to develop an economy when you don't have a highly skilled workforce. Right? These are twin challenges which aggravate each other and get in each other's way. I argue that these are an apparent catch-22, not something insurmountable. Both of these issues are rooted in a common set of causes, which are in Mississippi's culture. And that is something which I think we can make profound changes about. If we can change the culture, both of these other issues can be addressed. And that's not easy and it's not quick. It's something that's going to take time, but the first thing is to want to do that. And of course, to consider some steps to take for that end. So my thesis is that with good democratic leadership, we can shift the culture in ways necessary to surmount the catch-22 I've described. What I'm going to tell you about is a few words about my theory of democratic leadership, because what do I mean by that? Fair enough. And then I'm going to consider the question, how does this apply? What are examples of specific policy, you abstract philosopher? Let's get concrete, and I'll give you some thoughts I have about that. I don't have time to go over every detail, which is why I wrote a book about it, and it's at Square Books if you want a copy. So I'll obviously be brief and only cover some of the topics from the book. But in the third spot, I'll be talking about what I think is the most important virtue of democratic leadership, and that is unity, and thus the title of the book. And then last, if I still have time for it, I'm going to cover some specifics about particular policies which can be pursued for the ends that I'm suggesting, as well as the very good question, where's the money going to come from for this? Which is a difficult and good question people will ask. So let me begin talking about what I take democratic leadership to be. When looking at the philosophical tradition, I'm sorry to say there are very few contemporary philosophers writing on the subject of leadership, at least explicitly or directly. We write a lot about particular issues and debates. Scholars tend to focus on the finer issues, and that's great. We make progress by being very precise, and that's good. We also need folks to step back and look at the forest, sometimes. And that's more what I'm trying to do with this project. And when looking for philosophers who made contributions, the greatest seems to me, come from times when philosophy was authoritarian. Some of the deepest contributions come from them. For instance, Plato. But one of my heroes, who's a democratic thinker, John Dewey, argued that when philosophy isn't addressing an important issue, or when it has become stale or distant from real life, he said, go back to Plato. Now that's funny because Plato was not known to be very democratic in his thinking. And so why would Dewey say that? Well, I believe it's because Plato was right about a lot of things, and we can come back to his thought and ask the question, well, how does this help us for democracy if it does? Or could it? And so this is what I did. I went back to Plato's Republic, and there, appreciated very much. If you're looking for leadership, he's got 4 key virtues of the good city that he enumerates. 1 is wisdom. 2, courage. 3 is moderation, and the 4th is justice. And so when I developed the theory of democratic leadership, right, those are virtues which qualify a noun for leadership, and in Plato's day, the noun was guardian. A guardian inherently has paternalistic notions attached to it. When you think about where we hear the word guardian today, we usually hear it with respect to children, guardianship of children. You will hear it in military contexts. And I don't want to deny that leadership can involve guardianship even in democracy, insofar as we have military leaders who need to act as guardians explicitly and literally, in some senses. But, of course, as a philosopher, I'm looking for the more general understanding, not just the unique one for the military, for instance. And so, if I want to shuck some of the authoritarian qualities from Plato, that's the first place I looked, is to say, okay, let me come back to Dewey, this democratic thinker, and ask, well, what would he use as a noun for thinking about a leader, which we then will qualify with the qualities of the leadership that we want, the kinds of leaders that we want. And when looking to Dewey, the term I found and appreciated very much is guidance, to be a guide. The reason for that is guides don't sound authoritarian. When you go on a guided tour, A, you often don't have to follow the guide. B, you don't really have to listen. And C, if you're with my grandmother, right, you will learn more from her guidance than from the tour guide. This is very much true. She's a brilliant historian. And that's the thing about guidance. It isn't only one person in a position of authority who can contribute to the guidance, but actually all of us might have something of value to contribute, potentially, in the guided tour, or on the guided tour. So guidance is the term I would use. And then the big wonky definition, therefore, I came up with uses those 4 virtues with respect to guidance, and it calls it the application of wisdom and justice with courage and moderation to the guidance of human conduct. That's what I take good leadership to be. The application of wisdom and justice with courage and moderation to the guidance of human conduct. That's huge and wonky, and I've been told it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. That's true. The nice thing about Plato is that he'd often have these long passages describing what he's talking about. And then he'd step back and say, so basically this means this. And there's a nice short statement. So there's a precedent for me being a little bit bumper sticker-ish. Okay? And so when I think about those three of those virtues, wisdom, moderation, and justice, those words to me are captured when I think of what it means to be judicious. Now, being judicious, you might exhibit that kind of characteristic without willingness to act. You might always be looking for more information, which can be cowardly. And so you still need that further distinct virtue, which is the enabling virtue, the virtue that makes you act when you're afraid anyway. Right? And that is courage. And therefore, I have to make it as short as I can. The best I can do is to call good leadership judicious yet courageous guidance. Might fit on a bumper sticker. So, I said I was going to give you my brief understanding of democratic leadership. Of course, I go into a lot more detail about how that plays out for democracy, but I'm going to give you one example right now in terms of a particular practice and policy in Mississippi. In 2010, 2011, Mississippians were looking at policy about sex education. And until that time, schools didn't have to have a policy about sex education. In fact, they could not teach sex education. This law said that school districts had to adopt either a policy which used abstinence-only education for sex ed, or abstinence plus. Now, in either case, if parents weren't happy, they could what's the word I'm looking for? They could have their child opted out from that part of the education, especially from the abstinence plus. You know, I haven't thought about whether or not they can opt out from the abstinence only. That's an interesting question. But I suspect so. In any event, they can opt out of the plus part of the abstinence plus. That is true. Okay? Now, that means that if a school district picks abstinence plus, and parents don't want their kid getting exposed to that, they can opt out, they're happy. If parents want their kids to get that curriculum, they can. But in the school districts in which the school district picked abstinence only, parents who want their kids to get abstinence plus cannot. Right? So what could have been decided, the legislature could have picked for the state that we use an abstinence plus education, which is more comprehensive in what it covers than abstinence only, and allowed people to opt out. That would have been simpler. Now, what does that have to do with the virtues? Well, fundamentally, I'm thinking about wisdom. Okay, and when you think about wisdom in the modern era, you can look at what studies have to tell us. They don't tell you everything you need for wisdom. Fundamentally, good leaders need judgment, wise judgment. But how do you get that? One answer is, you got to know as much as you can about the empirical facts. Abstinence only, when people oppose it, they deny that it's effective. That's false. There is a measured, small, but measured positive effect in terms of decreased sexual behavior in kids who get an abstinence-only education. It's narrowly effective, and it's also effective only really after kids have started having sex. Abstinence plus education has been shown, however, to have a vastly greater effect in decreasing sexual activity and in reducing the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases, as well as, of course, thereby avoiding also unintended pregnancies. So, there seems to me to have been a simple proposal that leadership, and we can still make this change. Right? If we have the courage and the leadership to revisit the issue. We could decide that every school district is going to have abstinence plus, but of course people can opt out if they object. Right? That would let everybody have what they want. It would also, I argue, significantly decrease unintended pregnancies, the transmission of STDs, and also dropout rates, because it is harder to finish school once one has become pregnant. So this is one example. Now you might think, well, what if Mississippians don't want this? Here's the thing. I was mentioning studies as a source of wisdom. Well, that's a good question for judgment to consider, but we have facts about the matter. The Mississippi Center for Health Policy issued a survey. How many people are surveyed for the United States when you want to get a sense of who they're going to vote for president? 1,000, right? Does that sound familiar? Because after 1,000, the benefit and precision levels off, right? Nevertheless, the Mississippi Center for Health Policy surveyed 3,000 people. They got 3,000 respondents to generalize for a much smaller population, the 3 million people in the state of Mississippi. Overwhelmingly, Mississippians want comprehensive sex education. So much so that, in fact, the one thing entirely prohibited in the law is actually desired by Mississippians at a rate of 70%. 70% popularity. And that is condom demonstrations. The law explicitly forbids any of the school districts, public school districts, from giving condom demonstrations. Now, you might think and laugh to yourself, oh, it's, what, do we really need to do that anyway? Yes, condoms are extraordinarily successful at preventing what they're trying to prevent when you put them on right. They can be put on backwards, okay? And they can be put on without pinching the tip. If you know physics, you know it needs room for stuff. And therefore, there's a very simple set of instructions to be explained. And people who don't want to have sex, Catholic priests know this, right? Anybody can know this. And should, if they want to have a good sense of how to avoid STDs and how to avoid unintended pregnancies. So this is just one little example of an area in which I believe wisdom in leadership would look to available knowledge about what works best. We do need to consider various arguments about, well, I don't think government should be doing this with my children. No problem. The tool for that is the opt-out policy. We won't do it for your children, right? Jehovah's Witnesses may not want government to be doing things other like blood transfusions, at least for them, but we don't let that stop us from getting them for us, right? Some people having objections mean we won't do it to you. Fair enough. So one little example, it's not so little, I think, it's important. It was argued actually by a Mississippi First report that $150 million were estimated to be the cost of unintended pregnancies in Mississippi per year. So there's one example. I have a number of different examples about particular policies that I would talk about as far as what to do to make Mississippi better, to consider the culture. And this is a great example of a cultural concern. It's about those issues which seem fuzzy in the culture. What does that mean? I think I should be specific about that and be clear. What do I mean when I refer to the culture? What we mean by culture, among other things, is the language we use. It's the symbols we adopt to represent us. It's the beliefs we hold. It's our practices, individually and collectively, and it's our institutions. When you think about changing a culture, yes, that's a lot of things, but when you aim to do it, you can recognize the various places and contexts in which things are not being done as they should be. And this is one of the reasons, I think, why lots of people have frustrations when someone is trying a practice that they think will make things better for Mississippi. If we just focus on the one individual issue, how much change are we going to make? And that's frustrating. I understand that for people. But it seems to me what we need to consider, is an effort to shape the culture, which means all of those different issues. And thus, that gives us some guiding principles for thinking about any particular problem which comes up. What kind of culture are we trying to develop? And in the book, I won't go much into this in this talk. I'll just say simply that in the book, of course, my emphasis is on a democratic culture. And so one of the crucial elements of democracy versus the authoritarianism you had in Plato or in other hierarchical societies is that we're trying to avoid hierarchies. And yet in the United States, an African American male is 6 times more likely to go to prison in his lifetime than my son or me. In Canton County, Mississippi, in 2007, it was reported that the retention rate from freshman to senior year was 32%. That's not how many graduated. That's how many were still there their senior year. 80% of people in prison don't have a high school degree. We are channeling people into poverty and into prison. These are problems I think we can address when we value things right. And I pick sex ed because it's an example which doesn't cost you money, not much. I mean, we already have to have abstinence plus education options. And so how hard would it be to make sure everybody has access to that, but you can opt out? It's not big money to make that change. That's why I picked that example to start with. I mentioned, though, that I would focus on the most important virtue, as I understand it. I said that it was unity, but that was, for the philosophers in the room, that was a perhaps somewhat imprecise statement. Plato would say that the key virtue is moderation. But why? Why do we need moderation according to Plato? He said because that's how you keep the city united. When you have too much extremism of belief, too much division in terms of identity, conflict, he called them civil wars, but they can just be civil conflicts. You can't act. You can't get a legislature to pass a bill. You can't address a problem together. It wasn't during the American Civil War that we were trying to advance the sciences to the greatest extent we could, or to go to the moon or so on. There's a reason for that. You can't achieve the great things that we have and want to achieve when you're in civil war or in tremendous tension internally. That's why unity is so crucial. Plato argued that the greatest good for the society, for the city, he said, is that which makes it one instead of many. And the greatest evil, correspondingly, is that which makes it many instead of one. Right? That which tears us apart. And therefore, moderation is the process by which we achieve unity. And I'm going to ask some of my colleagues who are here, I believe that, and they'll tell me whether I should be thinking about this differently, but I see some of what they do as crucial for achieving moderation. Right? For instance, the William Winter Institute gets people to the table to talk to one another who don't often talk, at least about those issues, if at all. And MLK, long ago, said something which remains true to a great extent. The most segregated hour in America is on Sunday morning. The interesting thing about Mississippi is that we are, according to the polls, Gallup I think it was, the most Christian state in the nation. In that regard, then, we are a state which has perhaps the greatest commonality of certain beliefs that are said to be among the most important to people. And therefore, it seems to me, even though we have this really tough history, of course, we have remarkable grounds on which to find common values and to pursue common ends. So, as I said, the most important virtue is unity. I'll come back to ways in which I think we can pursue that, but my colleagues may also have more to say about it. Let me add that it is well known, probably to everybody in this room, that last summer there were multiple murders in Charleston, South Carolina. It may not be well known that in Mississippi in 2012, we had the prosecution of racially motivated murderers who killed James Craig Anderson by running over him with a truck, pickup truck, in Jackson, Mississippi. I think it happened in 2011. The case concluded in 2012. We have those kinds of murders here. It wasn't a mass murder in terms of numbers, but these young people were known to go to what they called Jaffrica in their cars, and they would bring slingshots with metal ball bearings, this is in the court record, and they would shoot them at African Americans on the street in Jackson, Mississippi. This is part of what I mean when I say our problems are fundamentally cultural. These are not some terrible aberration. They are not what we want Mississippi to be, and what the FBI folks from Mississippi said is these people do not represent Mississippi today. Well, there may be a lot of truth to that, but these things didn't come out of nowhere, as said Judge Carlton Reeves, U.S. District Court Judge from Mississippi. I actually had him to campus last semester. He's amazing. There's a beautiful speech he gave at the sentencing of the young people. They weren't all men. And that speech, by the way, is on NPR's website, and they called it breathtaking. When I saw that, I can attest, my breath was taken. It was amazing. I strongly encourage you to read that speech. Now, I partly bring that up because he notes in that speech, I'm still focused on unity here as the issue. In that speech, he talks about how many lynchings happened in the United States. We think about enemies and threats like the terrorists who killed 3,000 people where I grew up. I grew up part of my life in New York City. And we think about how many Americans died that day. He points out well over 5,000 African Americans were murdered in the South via lynching. The state that did it the most, Mississippi. The next most, Georgia. Here's what's fascinating. When I tell people, hey, what would you think about Jackson being home to the Olympics? I heard a little bit of it. They laugh at me, actually, is what was the first reaction I got. People laughed when I suggested, what do you think about bringing the Olympics to Jackson? People tended to laugh in the past. Maybe it's not so funny anymore. I hope it's not so funny anymore. It wasn't funny in Atlanta. Created huge developments. Yeah, there were conflicts about that's not my point. My point is that Atlanta tried to become a unified and cosmopolitan city. The first black mayor was Maynard Jackson. I went to school with his daughter. He was a very successful mayor, and he brought people together. Atlanta, yes, it has its neighborhoods and people divided, but they all want Atlanta to succeed. What happened in Jackson, you all know well. People got the hell out of Jackson. So who cares whether Jackson succeeds? So this is one of the things that's crucial. The first thing is that we have to realize that our destinies are intertwined, that we're all going to get better off when we try and foster unity. When we look at the causes of our educational problems and we consider things that are very cheap, and one clear example I said was sex education. I'll talk about another in a minute, very briefly. There are other things that do involve money, and they make a big difference. I'll mention some of them. So let me get to that. What can we do? Okay, so I'm in the Department of Public Policy Leadership. I'm a philosopher. I also, it's about 30 after, I want to give my colleagues time to talk and then us to have some discussion. But I'll try to be brief. Okay, there are policies that are cheap. I mentioned sex ed. Another one. When I came to Mississippi, I had a conversation with a writing class that I was directing. I discovered that students in my class had been paddled in public school. I was startled. I thought, that can't be legal anymore. That's not right. Where I grew up, it wasn't legal, actually. 19 states continue to use corporal punishment in public schools. It has been studied as well. It's one of my other examples when thinking about wisdom in leadership. Let's look at the effects of our practices, right? Let's look at what the studies have to say about what's good and bad for our people. The long-term effects of corporal punishment in public schools, there are associations with higher drug use, with unemployment, right? With incarceration. I'm not saying there's a direct cause. I'm talking about the culture, right? When you strike a child in public school, is that child more or less likely to ask the authority figure a question? I believe it's significantly less, and I have heard at least anecdotal testimony, and I have read significant numbers research. I think it would be very interesting for social scientists who want to do a qualitative set of interviews and studies of that. There would be a lot to say. 19 states still do this. Democratic education, according to John Dewey, needs to foster the intellectual and scientific habits of mind for us to appreciate wisdom and to put it to use, he argued. Corporal punishment clearly frustrates that end.
achieves the opposite, to my mind. A second policy that would cost nothing to make a difference to our culture. Now, if we implement crappy policy instead, we can have problems too, right? In Meridian, Mississippi, they don't hit kids. But when a person's pants sag, they call the police. The U.S. Department of Justice sued Meridian, Mississippi for having created a school-to-prison pipeline. And that has developed significantly since I wrote about that in the book. I need to catch up on where things are about that. I find it fascinating. But the school-to-prison pipeline language is a cultural idea. You're in schools training kids to have the cops come get you over the most minor of infractions, including, by the way, when the kid thinks this is totally unjust, that it was just my pants were a little low or what have you, the most minor of infractions. That policy change would cost us nothing, but we don't need to have a stupid alternative. There are effective and well-studied forms of discipline that are nonviolent and are not school-to-prison pipeline making. Okay, those are two policies that won't cost much. Policies that take investment. Here's just a few briefly. One, if you want to have greater unity, we need more communication. In a lot of the areas of Mississippi that are more rural, which means most of Mississippi, we don't have broadband internet and could very easily. We can leapfrog so many other states in terms of technology because today you could just put up towers. No particular business, AT&T and so forth, has an interest in investing in those towers, which is why you use government investment for that, which is why you all are still taxed on your phone line for the propagation of further phone lines right now. In 2008, a California town just got regular phone line service. So infrastructure is something that we invest in together and then have businesses run those broadband internet companies, sure. But let's enable more people to be able to reach their public officials, to reach each other. Blogs, listservs, all these different tools can radically empower people today. Things that take investment. Better schools, more investment in our teachers. We have so many vacancies in places. We invest a little bit in Teach for America and Mississippi Teacher Corps, and I advocate for those as long as we're not spending what we should be to get good teachers for permanent positions. But that should be our goal, I believe. Until we do that, I'm not against these other tools. Here's my rationale for that. If I've got 5 people bleeding and I've got 3 Band-Aids, I'm still going to use the Band-Aids or bandages. Third thing, opportunities and commitments for our graduates. Lots of kids struggle to be able to pay for school. Let's help them pay for school in exchange for their commitment, like we do in the military. 4 years in Como, Mississippi, let's say, or maybe they can move around. Underserved areas can be addressed. A lot of our problems can be addressed if we help young people have opportunities. They've got a job after they graduate. It's not in New York City or Nashville, but lots of people don't have jobs when they graduate. So some people feel lucky about that anyway. And they got substantial help for school, which they also feel lucky about. Lastly, where can the money come from? Tate Reeves has proposed significant tax cuts over the next decade. We already have a surplus. I think if I remember correctly, he was proposing $500 million in tax cuts. We have large tax cuts presently proposed because we have surpluses. That may not do everything you need for some of what I'm talking about, but there's another tax that seems very popular for good reason. It's called the Marketplace Fairness Act. Right now, you pay less to buy a book from Amazon than you do from Square Books. Square Books rightly can say, that's not fair, because we're not charging Amazon tax. You're not charging you tax for buying from Amazon. The Marketplace Fairness Act is a federal act, but lots of states are doing this individually already. New York has done this. Texas has done this. I think Georgia was looking at it. The state can do it itself and bring in revenues from those sources which are utterly untapped right now, create more fairness for our brick and mortar stores in Mississippi. Okay, and finally, it seems to me the crucial task is to have the will to do these things. You have to want to do them. You have to want to be unified. And if you don't, of course you're going to say there's no money for this. You make money for things. We didn't have money for Homeland Security. we had money for Homeland Security. We can make that happen. This is important, right? And we want it to be safe in that case. In this case, what we want, it seems to me, is greater unity and to pursue the future of Mississippi, which can be very promising. And as I said, I believe Mississippi's stock has been significantly undervalued. Thanks for coming today.
I hope you enjoyed this recording of my talk at Barnard Observatory on the University of Mississippi campus. You can follow this series on Twitter at PhilosophyBB for Philosophy Bakes Bread. And my main author account on Twitter is at Eric T. Weber, with one B on Weber. I'm also on Facebook with my author page, Eric Thomas Weber Author. Join me there too, and visit my website, ericthomasweber.org. Most of all, thanks for listening to Philosophy Bakes Bread, food for thought about life and leadership.